Dr. Vincent Bacot, the director of the Wheaton College Center for Applied Christian Ethics. And the reason that we're having this conversation today is basically because, in part, our theme this year is about being countercultural, being but not being anti-cultural. And part of that is having conversations about important things, and perhaps conversations that we haven't had very much here at Wheaton College, and trying to model a way of engaging difficult conversations or difficult topics or controversial topics, I think in a way that is constructive and informative. And this was particularly catalyzed, David Iglesias gave some public comments about a Christian response to torture. It occurred to me that we haven't really had a conversation about a response to terror. We haven't really had a conversation certainly about torture here on this campus. So after some conversation with my colleagues in political science, we put this together this afternoon. So I'm very thrilled that my colleague Dr. Brian McGraw has agreed to moderate this, and I'll hand it off to him to introduce our two guests, and we'll look for a very interesting conversation together. Brian, great.
My name is Professor Brian McGraw. I teach political theory over in the Politics and IR department. And let me just briefly give you a sense of what we're going to do today, and then introduce our guests. We're going to spend probably 20-25 minutes. I have some questions I'm going to sort of pitch to them about the American response to terrorism, particularly since 9/11. And then we'll open it up for your questions and concerns. And we really want to make this a kind of conversation. It's not a series of one-off lectures or one-off sort of monologues and whatnot. Here is Professor Iglesias, David Iglesias, who is the director of the Hastert Center. This is you're still in your first year, right?
Yeah.
We're glad he's here. He served at state, local, and federal levels as a federal prosecutor. He served at Gitmo. He's a retired Navy captain, he is. We're just thrilled that he's here, and hopefully sort of be able to shed some light on, well, a lot of the issues around those kinds of topics. Professor Will Inboden will be giving tonight at 7 o'clock in this same place, where you should return and listen to his lecture on conflicts in the Middle East and American foreign policy therein.
That's going to be too much Inboden in one day, Brian. So
it's a lot. No such thing. No such thing. He's the executive director of the William P. Clements Center for Strategy, History, Strategy, and Statecraft at the University of Texas at Austin. He's an associate professor in the LBJ School of Public Affairs. In past lives, he has worked on the policy planning staff at the Department of State and in the National Security Council, has extensive policy experience, in particular sort of in dealing with strategy, national security strategy, and so on. So let me get things going, and this is for Professor Inboden, if you wouldn't mind sort of starting off. If you were to kind of be able to sort of characterize kind of American strategy vis-a-vis terrorism, right? Particularly since 9/11, right? I mean, there were terrorist attacks before that, but particularly since 9/11, how would you characterize it? Like, what were the big components of American strategy since then?
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me here, Brian. It's especially an honor to be here with Professor Iglesias. I know he's a relative newcomer to Wheaton in this phase of running the Hastert Center, but as someone who was in Washington for a long time, let me say that he looms very large in the national security community and is a great get for Wheaton. So please exploit him. Please, I mean that in the Christian sense of exploitation, of course. But to have someone of his practitioner's experience, real-world practice here on campus is an invaluable resource. So I hope all of you have a chance to get to know him, take his classes, and take Professor McGraw's classes too, of course. As the outsider, I can say this. So to rewind for a little bit, I was in Washington, D.C. on 9/11. I was in the process of joining the Bush administration. I was not yet in government, but I was very close to the Pentagon when it was hit, and then was a few blocks from the White House when Todd Beamer, among others, in his act of heroism, prevented the fourth plane from hitting Washington. And it may seem, I know, to this generation of students like that's more and more the distant past, but for those of us who lived through it, it was a very searing experience. You know, everyone remembers where they were on that day, even if you weren't in New York or Washington, but especially for those of us who are in one of the two cities that were hit. And as I look back now, almost 14 years later, reflecting on my several years in the Bush administration, where I was one of the people involved in some of the higher level strategies we were trying to do, it's interesting to think about what we got right, in my estimation, what we got wrong, in my estimation, what strategic principles have endured, what ones have been chucked by the wayside because they were either immoral or not working. And I know we'll be talking about a lot of that today. So thinking about what is the American strategy towards counterterrorism today, well, first I'll say this, that if you would have told any of us who are in Washington or New York, for that matter, on September 12th, the day after that, almost 14 years later, we'd be sitting here and the United States would not have been hit again on a large scale. I know there's been a couple of these lone wolf attacks, the Boston bombers, Major Nidal Hassan at Fort Hood, things like that, but we haven't been hit on a large scale again. We all would have been dumbfounded. In the weeks and months after 9/11, the question was not if they'll hit us again, it was when and where are they going to hit us again. And that was the mentality of the time. This is not to justify some of the strategic and moral errors I think were made, but just to give you a sense of even what everyone on up to President Bush thought. We were all just on edge waiting for that. And strategy and policy was devised in that window, in that crucible. The president and his national security team didn't have the luxury of sitting in graduate school seminars or conference rooms for months on end debating these things. They had to be coming up with this on the fly. And looking back, the Bush administration settled on a few principles early on that, with some modification, I think arguably the Obama administration is still following today. They may put some different rhetorical coats on them, but one would be preemptive action. This is often associated with the Iraq War. The correct term there was really preventive if we want to get into just war theory. But by this I mean trying to take action against terrorist threats or perceived terrorist threats. I'm trying to put this in neutral ways, okay? We can talk about the normative, the right and wrong, and the strategically and moral. We're happy to have that. Which in terms of describing what the doctrines are. Taking action against the terrorist threat before, the perceived terrorist threat before it hits us. And the Bush administration did this in a number of ways, but this is really what the Obama administration is doing with the drone campaign. By and large, the vast majority of the drone strikes, which are taking out, legitimate or illegitimate targets, we can talk about that. These are not people who are about to pull the trigger. They're ones perhaps planning, they're ones perhaps with malicious intent, but these are preemptive actions that we are taking against terrorist threats before they hit us. There's a certain history of this in the laws of war, but it's also contested, and I think something that needs to be debated more. The Obama administration, criticized a lot of this during the campaign, but then adopted a lot of it once they came into office. Another principle is that Bush developed, and I think the Obama people have largely followed, is not distinguishing between the terrorists themselves and then the countries that harbor them. Now, this can be whether it's a malevolent regime, such as Iran or Afghanistan under the Taliban, or it can also be poorly governed states such as Yemen or Somalia, where a lot of this activity is taking place. But essentially, the doctrine is if there are perceived terrorists in this territory, then we are going to treat that entire territory as more or less hostile. Doesn't mean the government itself is always going to be at fault, but at least be treated as not able to govern their own space. Another one, and this I think gets on the legal dimensions, which I'll want to hear from. I think we'll all want to hear from David on, but also some of the moral ones is. Most American actions are still by and large unilateral. A lot of these do not have UN authorization, international law. My take on this as a historian and not a lawyer is somewhat murky here. the Bush administration did a lot of chest thumping about unilateralism. The Obama administration pretends not to mention the word, but acts that same way. Particularly again with the drone strikes in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia. These are not done under UN sanction. They're not done as part of a big coalition. This United States acting as the United States, and even the congressional authorities, I think, for this are somewhat dubious. I mean, I want to hear your take, David. I think the 2001 AUMF has been stretched beyond all recognition. I think we should probably get another one. But I'm the non-lawyer, so I'm practicing law without a license up here. So preemption, unilateralism, and doing this without a clear mandate in international law. But perhaps there is a case that this is being done morally still. I think there actually can be a case that some of these actions are moral. They're in some difficult gray areas. But this is where morality and the law do not always align perfectly. I wish they did. That's one of any of you going into international law, I'd like to see more alignment between morality and the law. So I've been riffing enough.
So this question for David, actually, sort of. So in terms of legal strategy, right? I mean, obviously there's a raft of new or at least sort of newly vivid legal questions that come up with sort of the American response to 9/11. How would you evaluate sort of American legal strategy since 9/11? I mean, are there things that we've done well? Things that we've done really poorly? I mean, how would you evaluate this?
Yeah, I was really struck by your comment, Will, about 12 years ago no one would have thought we wouldn't have been hit in a major way. I'll never forget a call from the former Deputy Attorney General during the election of 2004. That's Jim Comey, who's now the FBI Director. And he had all the United States attorneys on the phone. He said, ladies and gentlemen, our evidence is that we're going to be hit big in the next few weeks. And your job is to shake every tree and prevent that second large attack from happening. And I remember the hair on the back of my neck. It's standing up now, but it was doing that at that time, thinking, oh no, we've got another 9/11. And we didn't, and we haven't. So I think, to a large degree, we've been successful in dismantling Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda cannot mount the type of catastrophic attack that it did in September of 2001. It still exists, but has been largely defanged. Getting back to your question, Will, about the AUMF of 2001, if you look at the language, and my class just studied this, it's directed toward the organizations, including Al-Qaeda, that were responsible for 9/11. Okay. So Al-Qaeda, as I just stated, is largely defanged, deconstructed. So to the extent that AUMF is still in place, it's very tenuous that we can mount anything else, which is why the Obama administration has proposed a new AUMF of 2015, which would cover other types of counterterrorist activity. So legally, our response was primarily military. And we used our armed forces to retake Afghanistan, which had been a haven for Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. So we did a good job there. We've largely dismantled Al-Qaeda. That's good. We made some mistakes along the way. Certainly our interrogation practices fell way short of what we stand for as a country, and in my view as a lawyer, violated the several international treaties that we signed as a country. So we did make some mistakes. Now, one thing that I hope the audience understands is Will was operating from a policy-making level in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, whereas I was operating as an operator, so to speak, as a United States attorney who actually implemented policy. So my job was to keep a close look on the southwest border, make sure we had no Al-Qaeda operatives sneaking across the border with illegal immigrants. So that was my contribution, and then as a Navy JAG reservist, that was to support the military any way possible in taking the fight to the enemy overseas, not letting them come back to the U.S., but taking that fight overseas to our enemies.
So we sort of ask you sort of a follow-on question to that. If you had been sort of in the White House and been asked sort of for legal advice on what to do with the people who ended up in Guantanamo Bay, for instance, sort of detainees, right? People who are very plausibly, indeed, probably were quite, they're on the bad side of things, but they're not regular soldiers. They don't quite fit into any kind of nice, neat legal categories. What would you have recommended the administration? Because you're sort of on record as suggesting that the administration made serious, significant mistakes and legal mistakes. What would you have suggested?
Well, Common Article 3 of the Geneva Convention makes clear that even sub-state actors such as terrorists are required to be treated humanely. And that's what we did not do for a number of years until, for instance, Senator John McCain introduced a Detainee Treatment Act. We had a hard time figuring out what to do with these guys because they were clearly not members of a nation state, such as a foreign soldier, such as a German soldier or a Japanese soldier during World War II that typically obeyed the laws of war. So, and the administration had legal cover from the John Woo memo of January of 2002 and the Jay Bybee memo of August of 2002, in which they basically said, we can treat these folks in any way we want, provided there's no organ failure or imminent death, which means pretty much anything is permissible. And if you know anything about how the Justice DOJ works, is when the Office of Legal Counsel issues an opinion, it's binding on the executive branch. So it's a powerful piece. So our agencies had the ability legally for just a few years to use, in my view, conduct that violated the Convention Against Torture, Common Article 3, and the War Crimes Act, which became federal legislation in the 1980s. To answer your question directly, we should have treated them as normal combatants. I'm not as bothered with the location of Guantanamo because we needed a place that was close to the United States. Leaving them overseas, I think, would have been problematic. Bringing them into the United States would have been problematic too, because then they would have lawyered up, and then we would have had to have used the Justice Department to prosecute them as common criminals. And I'm willing to concede that you can't treat a terrorist like a common criminal, but they still maintain residual rights to be treated humanely. So I think the mistake we made was not just putting them in Guantanamo. I'm okay with that, but allowing them to be maltreated. That created a whole set of other legal and moral problems.
If I can jump in on this here, because embedded in David's remarks, there was a really important strategic principle I forgot to mention earlier, which is that the Bush administration decided that this is a war. And that's not just rhetoric to get the American people fired up and address the joint session of Congress or whatever. There's a whole set of legal and moral and tactical and strategic implications that go along with that. And the Obama administration, again, has largely, as a matter of doctrine, continued treating this as a war. That's why they're asking for a new authorization to use military force against the Islamic State, things like that. And this, again, may seem self-evident and common sense. Americans, well, look, they killed 3,000 of us on 9/11. If that's not an act of war, I don't know what is. That's 1,000 more people than were killed at Pearl Harbor. But not to get into too much of the 90s, but there is a case to be made. I don't buy, but there is a case to be made that terrorism is more of a law enforcement legal problem. Now, in truth, it's everything. It's an intelligence problem. It's a political development problem. It's a law enforcement legal problem, and it's a war, and it's a military challenge. And that's why perhaps the best analogy to the struggle, the conflict we're in right now is really to the Cold War, where you're going to have some localized kinetic manifestations of hot war, as we did with Afghanistan, arguably Iraq. But also there's the ideological challenge of how do you change people's mind not to follow this poisonous totalitarian ideology, whether it's communism or militant jihadism. And then there's the legal matter of how do you preserve civil liberties under our Constitution for Americans at home, and then how do you preserve and protect the civil liberties that other people have through their innate dignity as being human beings, even if they're non-Americans and bad actors, or that are protected on international law, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and things like this. And so in deciding that this conflict was largely a war, as the Bush administration did and the Obama administration did, even though a lot of things followed, that doesn't mean that it's only a war. That doesn't mean that the only instruments in it are, the SEALs that took out bin Laden or any number of, forward deployed military units, but rather you need to have the intelligence professionals and the lawyers and the USAID people out there too.
So why don't we take questions from you all? I have some other questions in case there's quiet or silence or whatever, but I'd be interested in hear what our audience might have. No doubt you came with questions in your head or in your pocket and things that you would like to have answered from either one of our guests.
Restate those questions.
Right, and I'll try to restate the questions because I have a somewhat loud voice.
This is to Captain Iglesias. You mentioned that you weren't concerned about the location of Guantanamo because there's an issue of bringing them into the States. What are the ramifications, though, the fact that our U.S. military base is considered American territory, and what are the legal ramifications of that if they are?
Yeah, so,
You
so the question is, how do we treat Guantanamo? Because it's technically part of Cuba. Cuba still owns it, but it's under United States jurisdiction. So there's no concurrent jurisdiction with Cuba. Well, the base of Guantanamo has been around since 1902. It's our oldest overseas base. We've used it for a variety of things, and most recently we've used it to hold these detainees. I think it's the appropriate place because I viewed the attacks on 9/11 as more of an act of war than a gigantic crime scene. I mean, you could make a case that the Justice Department should have prosecuted the attack on New York. I think the better response is it's really a military action. It needs to be treated as this country has treated other military war crimes with the military commissions. So I was supportive of the Bush administration saying we need to treat these as war crimes. We need to treat them as war criminals, not common criminals. Therefore, really, any location overseas would have been an appropriate venue. I mean, we could have set up a war crime tribunal in Iraq or Afghanistan. And that would have been okay. But I think the location of Guantanamo is good because that allowed other agencies to come down and question them. Now, the manner in which they were questioned was problematic for a period of a few years. But to me, and I understand former Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld called Guantanamo the least worst place. I understand why he says that. But I do see some advantages of having the commissions there versus the mainland or overseas. And I don't know if my colleague here thinks differently.
Yeah, as a non-lawyer, I defer to that very good bit of legal reasoning you just heard there. No, it seems to make sense because if this was an act of war, if it was a military attack on us, which I think it was, even though it wasn't by troops from a recognized nation state because they weren't wearing insignia, because they didn't follow the usual model of, say, when Japan attacked us at Pearl Harbor. Although remember, I mean, maybe it passes the common sense test. Bin Laden declared war on the United States. His 1996 fatwa declared war on the United States, and so raises an interesting existential question. Are we at war with them if they say they're at war with us? And I think so.
In retrospect, do you think it would have been better for Bush to have asked for a formal declaration of war against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban?
I'll give a policy-ish answer, and then I'll defer to David on the legal answer. I don't think so. My sense from talking to my lawyer friends is that formal declarations of war are somewhat obsolete. We haven't had one since we declared war on Germany on, what was that, December 11th, 1946?
I'm sorry, the 8th.
Germany, the 8th was Japan, but then Germany declared war on us on the 11th, and then we didn't declare war on them until that. So that was, I think, the declaration of war in Nazi Germany 5 days after Pearl Harbor, 4 or 5 days, was the last declaration of war. Because then once the UN Charter was adopted with inherent right of self-defense, no longer were formal declaration of wars needed because that's now recognized under UN law. So that's why we get from Congress authorizations to use military force. My sense as the non-lawyer, but from looking at this historically. Now, as a policy, a political matter, I think Bush was absolutely right to go to Congress and asked for an authorization. He did this for whatever else you may think about the Bush administration. It was notable that they went to Congress and asked for authorization in 2001 to attack Afghanistan and associated elements of Al-Qaeda, and then in 2002 to attack Iraq a few months later. I say that because the Obama administration did not do that. They never got congressional authorization to attack Libya. And I think as a policy matter, it's just wise. It will do more to unite the country if the people's representatives in the legislature are able to do a formal vote saying that we support this use of military force, which is, I think, a de facto declaration of war. So.
Yeah, and to answer that question, I don't think it would have made any difference. Whether you call it an AUMF, an authorization for use of military force, or declare war. But I do think that the executive, the president, does need to get authorization from Congress. I mean, there is the War Powers Act, which Congress passed. It's never been fully challenged, so no one is really sure if it's fully in effect. Is the president really required to get authorization? The answer is probably yes, but the Supreme Court has never heard that specific issue, so no one really knows. But I think the more politic thing to do for a president who relies on funding by the Congress is to get some level of authority. But in terms of, did the AUMF result in fewer bombs and fewer tanks and fewer ships being deployed? No. So no difference in our offensive military capability.
Well, I'm just going to add to this, and I don't want to dominate this at all, but having spoken to a number of the attorneys who were down at Gitmo representing the detainees, their argument is that he should have asked for a declaration of war because it would have made it more difficult for them to have access to the detainees. And many of them shut up after they met with the lawyers. Prior to that, we were getting more information than we got after the lawyers came in. And they thought that a lack of a formal declaration of war was something that worked to their advantage. So
That's interesting. I know quite a few JAGs and civilian lawyers who have represented detainees. I've not heard that. That doesn't surprise me, but having been a defense counsel myself, would that have helped my cause? I'll have to say reasonable minds differ on that. I'm not sure I'm persuaded by that.
Our country is a country that prides itself on the high moral ground and in a sense, our moral superiority. A lot of that went down the tubes after 9/11. And I'm wondering why you think that these moral lapses occurred with the treatment of prisoners and torture, or was it just simply anger and retribution? And what safeguards are there or should there be in the future to avoid this kind of problem of outrage and anger when we are attacked by some other force or country in the future?
I can take a crack at it first. So, I mean, one of the things that you don't hear people talk about much is in the fall of 2001, there was a lot of fear in Washington. I mean, I remember meeting with John Ashcroft in his office and wondering, could Al-Qaeda build a bomb big enough to take out the 5th floor where his office was? I remember seeing the Jersey barriers. I remember seeing sandbags. I mean, it was a militarized city.
And we had anthrax and the DC sniper too.
That's
It's
right.
Crazy.
That's right. So, which I completely forgot about. But you're absolutely right. So there's a lot of fear there. I think people act in a defensive posture anytime there's fear. There was a lot of anger, but I think our tendency of being a nation of laws and not men, in this sense, hurt us because we had a notional memos that from Bybee and Wu and you rather at the Justice Departments, which gave us legal cover. They were eventually withdrawn as being ill-founded. But I am critical of our response until we turned it around, until we fixed the commissions to give greater due process rights for the detainees, until the Detainee Treatment Act was passed. So we did make a mistake for a number of years, but I don't think you can argue any time after about 2007 did we as a nation lose our moral standing. Abu Ghraib was a terrible stain, but that was done by low-level soldiers. They were turned in by another soldier, investigated by the Army. Those soldiers were court-martialed, and they were punished. So it wasn't as if the actors acted with impunity. There were legal consequences for what they did. So one of the reasons I do like and love America is because we do have an ability to self-correct. We made terrible mistakes. We're not making those same mistakes now. I don't see us going back to that.
I'll agree with everything David said there, and I'll add a couple things too, which is, this is why discussions like this, when we're not under terrorist attack, when we can talk about these rationally but sincerely, are important times to do a lot of our moral reasoning, because when you are in the crucible, when you drive past the Pentagon a week after the attack and you still see black smoke coming out, when you had friends killed in this, it's easy to just be consumed with anger and vindictiveness. And some of that is righteous, but a lot of it is not, is probably more base. And so to have both a legal structure and then a moral compass to restrain us from lowering ourselves to the level of terrorists, I think is really important. By and large, I think our country did maintain that bearing, with some of the exceptions that we've discussed. And it's also, I think, bears remembering, the things that didn't happen. After 9/11, there was a real fear at the White House that the American people would essentially go on pogroms against American Muslims. A few days after the attacks, Bush went down to the Grand Mosque on Massachusetts Avenue to show respect for the Islamic faith, to call on Americans. That's when the first time he said Islam's a religion of peace, which he was much criticized for, but to make clear to Americans, this is not a war on Islam. We all can give the talk on how the war on terror is a misnomer, terror is a tactic, yes, we all agree. That came up, though, because the White House has bent over backwards to make clear Islam is not the enemy. It's this one particular group of terrorists acting in the name of Islam. And American Muslims are still, by and large, fully respected, fully integrated members of American society. Last year in the United States, there were twice as many hate crimes against Jews as there were against Muslims. This is not to downplay things like when that horrible killing happened in North Carolina a few weeks ago, when that disgruntled atheist killed the 3 Muslims. I don't want to trivialize that at all. Yes, there have been some excesses, but I also think that there are some ways the United States really did keep its moral bearing. Remember that the enemy are these Al-Qaeda jihadists and not all of Islam, especially realizing eventually that some of the biggest victims of terrorism are other Muslims. I mean, probably 10 times more Muslims have been killed by jihadist terrorists than non-Muslims, and our most important allies in the fight against the jihadists are non-jihadist Muslims, who are certainly the majority of Muslims. And so that's, I think, a domain about the United States' internal treatment of our Muslim citizens here, as well as our relations with other Muslim countries, that we've more or less kept a pretty good bearing on, with some notable exceptions that we need to come clean about. But as David said, we have these self-correcting mechanisms as a nation of laws.
To what extent do you think Obama's dependence on drone strikes is an effort to avoid some of the legal problems with indefinite detention in Guantanamo Bay? And how would you justify legally or morally the drone strikes if we're saying that things got better after 2007? Are drone strikes okay from a legal, moral, and especially Christian perspective?
Yeah, I don't see drone strikes as being any different than the Allied bombing of German and Japanese cities. I mean, it is a war. I don't see this as an extensive police action. It's a war. There was a declaration of war by Al-Qaeda twice in the 1990s. You don't have to warn your enemies that you're going to bomb them. So I'm not bothered by a just war theory, because there are groups out there that not only hate Americans and Israelis, they also hate a lot of Muslims that they disagree with. So I'm not sure I understand the rationale that instead of bombing them, we should arrest them and then put them in Guantanamo. That's certainly an option that President Obama has. I don't criticize him for using military means to a military problem. Now, he may have secondary law enforcement issues, but that's one less combatant you have to worry about. Yeah. Now, where it becomes troublesome to me, and that's why anytime there's a drone strike, there are lawyers that vet that process. If there is a high possibility of collateral damage, which is code for killing non-combatants, then typically that drone strike is not going to happen. I mean, they really try to do as targeted of a strike as possible. And there have been some situations in which there have been a lot of non-combatants, typically family members and friends, near the target, and they've called it off. So it's not as if the Obama strike team is just willy-nilly killing people without any rationale. I mean, I think that it's highly premeditated, and I think there are enough safeguard bills in where it doesn't offend my notions of a just war.
Yeah, I'll again largely agree with David there. I mean, because I do think this is a war, because I do think drone strikes are a legitimate act of essentially anticipatory self-defense, to use the technical term, against people who are actively plotting to kill Americans and our allies. But there is I do think there's two big areas we need to have a strategic debate in this country. One is the overall utility of these drone strikes. Particularly, the local resentments they inspire. The possibility, look, not to be crude about it, but when you kill someone, you can't interrogate them. You can't get information from them. And there's some real trade-offs there. Yeah, we may have had the legal and moral right to kill that guy, plotting to kill Americans, but we also missed the chance to glean intelligence from him. And so I think having a debate about some of the potential negative externalities, negative consequences of the drone strikes in terms of lost intelligence, and also damaged reputation to the United States. All that said, I mean, I've had that debate with friends and in my own head, and I'll come clean. I still support the drone strike campaign, I do, but I think that I do wish that we had a larger debate in the country, that Congress is more involved and had a more robust authorization of those, because they're still taking place under this 2001 law, which has, I think, been stretched too far. Another one hasn't come up yet, I think we need to have a real debate on, is electronic surveillance and Edward Snowden. I find it's always an interesting gut check question to ask people, and I'm not going to ask for a show of hands here. Is Edward Snowden a traitor or a hero? And I know it's real binary, and maybe he's a little bit of both. I happen to think he's a traitor. I'll come clean on that. But a lot of my students think he's a hero, and I think there's a generational divide on some of this. They come down to how close were you to 9/11? How much does that shape your consciousness about the civil liberties we're allowed to concede some territory on? But Americans, we sometimes want to have it both ways. We want to be absolutely safe. We want to make sure our government does everything it can to make sure we don't have another 9/11 attack. And oh, by the way, we want to be able to say and do anything in complete privacy and not be subject to any of these sort of restrictions or curtailments. Of course, in truth, anyone who has a Facebook account or a Gmail account, you're giving up your private information all the time. You're just doing it to corporate America rather than to the NSA. But I think we need to have a bigger debate in this country about those real trade-offs that have been exacerbated by the Snowden stuff. Because if we were to suffer another large-scale attack, and heaven forbid, I certainly hope it doesn't happen, I think you'll see public opinion shift sharply, saying, why didn't we do more? Why didn't we detect this? Why wasn't more done? And we'll have congressional inquisitions and things like that. Whereas one of the luxuries of going 13 and a half, 14 years now since 9/11 is it does breed a certain sense of maybe complacency. But here's the thing, I don't want the United States to be a garrison state. I don't want us to be this large Leviathan national security state where we're constantly under siege, we're constantly looking where's the next terrorist going to come. One of the blessings of being Americans is living in a relatively free and open society, having the buffers of the two oceans, and then peaceful relations with our neighbors to the north and south, and not having to worry on a daily basis about being attacked. And so we want to be able to go about our lives that way, but we also need to have a certain level of vigilance. It's almost, and there's trade-offs there. It's almost an impossible balance to strike.
Just as a follow-up, I'm going to give you three options: hero, traitor, or something else. Okay, so hero, Snowden is a hero. You aren't being graded for this. All right. Traitor. Okay, good show of hands. Yes.
Okay.
Something else. So there's okay. So I think probably that has the second highest number of votes. Snowden is quite problematic because the federal prosecutor in me comes out and says, there's a right way of airing problems and a wrong way, and he did discover a lot of abuses and a lot of a lot of government misconduct, but then so did Daniel Ellsberg during the Vietnam era, and Ellsberg stuck around for his trial. He didn't abscond to Russia and make friends with whoever was the premier of Russia at that time. He let the process.
Yeah.
I was going to say Khrushchev, but I think he'd already died at that point. Brezhnev, thank you.
They were all bad guys. It's
Yeah.
all before your time, trust me. So they made Putin seem like patty cakes. I mean, so.
But the point between Ellsberg and Snowden is Ellsberg did it right, went through the process, was cleared. Snowden did it the wrong way. So that's what troubles me. about
Yeah,
this.
that's what troubled me about Snowden is that he went to one of our adversaries, and he's turned over a lot of stuff. And he also was indiscriminate in what he turned over and revealed. There were some abuses going on. I mean, I won't deny that at all. But there's a proper channel to go through. We should have gone to Congress on that and have them vetted, rather than turning over. Look, there's a lot of bad guys out in the world who are using different systems now, who we are not monitoring like we used to be because of what he turned over. America is at a higher risk now of terrorist attack than we were before Snowden. That's just a fact. Fortunately, we haven't suffered materially from it yet.
So actually, this is David, a question for you, also a clarification question. I've often wondered, what is the legal authority of these memos that, for instance, John Yoo, and it seems like these are referenced as though they have independent legal weight. Are they a summary of existing law, or do they have actually an independent legal force within themselves?
Okay, so the question is, there are two, and these are commonly referred to as the DOJ, the Department of Justice torture memos. One came out in early '02, and the other one in the summer of '02. One was to the Secretary of Defense, Haynes. The other one was to my former boss, Alberto Gonzalez. So Yu's memo, and remember, he worked at the office.
Who was White House counsel at the time, right?
Gonzalez was the White House counsel, so
Yeah,
he was
okay.
not the Attorney General yet. So Yu was at Office of Legal Counsel, which again writes these binding opinions that binds the executive branch. A very powerful position, probably, arguably for a lawyer, the most powerful place you can work on the executive branch. So what you tried to figure out was, how do we use abusive interrogation techniques, my words, not his, without running afoul of the War Crimes Act? Because if you literally read the War Crimes Act, which is essentially a federal codification of the Convention Against Torture, any American, regardless of military, CIA, whatever, that does these is going to be subject to federal prosecution. So how do we insulate this? So Yu figures out a way. I disagree with his conclusion, but he figured out a way. Bybee writes a more extensive memo, which goes to Alberto Gonzalez, in which he's defining torture. And lawyers live in the definitions. We love the footnotes. We love to cite precedent. And Bybee puts out, in my view, this Byzantine, Rube Goldberg-esque legal justification, in which he says, okay, it's okay to do these following things, which international law says we can't, as long as it doesn't lead to organ failure or death. We're okay. Well, that's all the legal justification that our administration needed. So for a period of a few years, they were able to do that. And I tell my class, it's the ultimate stay out of jail card that you can have. So CIA, military interrogators, law enforcement, they can do that. Now, I'm going to put in a plug for my friend Ali Soufan, who's coming next week, because he was one of the first FBI agents to see what was going on and say, I'm not going to do that, because we prosecute guys for doing what the CIA contractors were doing right in front of my face. And he stepped out of it, and history sided with Ali. And we went through a very dark period of time, in my view, morally. Did we get results? I think we can probably argue till the cows come home about that point. But I hope that answered your question.
So I guess so the answer seems to be that those memos they're interpreting law. They're not making law, because it almost sounds like they're interpretation, because you said they're legally binding, so it's a legally binding interpretation of the law?
They're giving opinions based on what the law is.
Okay.
But those opinions are binding on the executive branch.
So it's almost like a Supreme Court decision, or like a court decision. It sounds like almost like
Right, and it can only be overturned by the Justice Department or by a federal court.
But they're no longer binding because they were withdrawn, right?
Correct.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Correct.
I just know that ISIS is doing a lot of recruiting from the West. Do you know what our current policy is in America for American domestic citizens that are recruiting for ISIS? And what do you think on that about that policy?
Okay, I'll take a stab at this one. Great question. The question is about ISIS, the Islamic State, and its efforts to recruit subjects and new participants in the West. So going back to when I started my remarks talking about right after 9/11, all of us expected we were going to get hit again, that we'd be very surprised to be here 14 years later. Not. I'll tell you another surprise, though, is that if you would have told us in Washington and government right after 9/11 that 14 years later that core al-Qaeda would have been weakened like it was, but that meanwhile there would be a proliferation of jihadist franchises, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, et cetera, and this new, arguably even more nasty, more brutal, more horrific group called the Islamic State, which does set up a caliphate and controls a third of Iraq's territory and large swaths of Syria, and is attracting recruits from all over the world, a few thousand of whom have Western passports. If you would have told me that after 9/11, I'd say, we're not in very good shape. And so I do think we're in this new, very dangerous, very murky, very troublesome phase of this conflict, this war, which is still difficult to name, because there's a few unique attributes to the Islamic State that we haven't seen with these jihadist groups before. One is the formal control of territory. Al-Qaeda never governed Afghanistan. The Taliban was governing Afghanistan, and Al-Qaeda was there on kind of really cheap rent, essentially. So it's a symbiotic relationship, but the Taliban was the formal authority. No longer. The Islamic State has formal control over those swaths of Iraq and Syria, and now arguably some pockets of Libya too. So that's one, formal control of territory. Another is independent revenue sources. Al-Qaeda before was largely relied on financing from a few radical sheikhs in some Gulf countries, giving his philanthropy and some of bin Laden's construction fortune. The Islamic State is making a lot of money from selling oil on the black market, from ransoms, from kidnappings, and they're now becoming pretty wealthy. A third unique characteristic, they've actually formally set up a caliphate. Now that's a technical aspect of Islamic history and law, but for propaganda purposes, it's very powerful because bin Laden, for all of his chutzpah, the late bin Laden, he always wanted to set up a caliphate, he never actually did. And now the Islamic State has done that. And that is repellent to most of the world's Muslims and inspirational and attractive to a small but dangerous minority. And then finally, going back to your thing, a unique attribute of the Islamic State is at least 2,000 or 3,000 of them have European and American passports. Most Al-Qaeda guys did not have Western passports, and particularly with the permeable borders in the EU and visa waiver and things like this makes it a lot easier for them to travel back and forth. Now we're trying to keep an eye on this. This is largely the domain of the FBI. Fortunately, FBI is cooperating a lot better with the CIA ever since the Homeland Security, a number of these, and the Patriot Act and a lot of the post 9/11 reforms. But it's worrisome. One reason, the one ideological advantage to all this is thus far the Islamic State seems mostly to be focused on the region itself. Al-Qaeda had the doctrine of attacking the far enemy. That's why they wanted to go after the US rather than other countries in the region. The Islamic State seems more focused on the broader Middle East right now, but all it takes is a few of these guys going rogue or reinterpreting some aspect of jihadist ideology, decide that they're going to use their Western passports and to hit Western targets. So it's very worrisome. I mean, former acting CIA Director John McLaughlin, we had him out to UT a few weeks ago, and he said that he thinks we're now in the most dangerous phase since September 10th, as far as the number of jihadist groups out there who have the capability and the means and the intent of hitting the U.S. So I didn't come here to scaremonger, but that's what Director McLaughlin said. I don't know if you want to.
The biggest weapon that the Justice Department has using law enforcement means is the material support of terrorism statute, which is incredibly broad. You send money. I mean, there's a local Chicago area woman who sent a few $100s. I mean, that's a pittance. And she's
a lot of money if you're a college student, but okay.
Well, that's 50 pizzas. But she was indicted recently for material support of terrorism. So you don't have to send thousands of dollars. You don't have to send expensive equipment, but you can provide a service and virtually any amount of money and be vulnerable to a federal prosecution. So that's a powerful tool that domestic law enforcement has to make sure that Americans are not supporting foreign terrorists. Even if that terrorist group doesn't have an immediate threat to the United States, the Justice Department has significant tools to stamp out that here in the U.S.
I can ask a follow-up question. I know in Australia there's an individual who is advocating and recruiting for ISIS, and they have him under house arrest. If a U.S. citizen were simply to recruit and not to send money, does that, I mean...
That's still providing a service,
Okay.
and that would not be protected First Amendment speech.
Do you know how broadly that is? I mean, does sharing a video that ISIS puts out include this? I mean, how strictly would they
I
interpret
would
that?
need more facts. If he's standing on a street corner saying give money to ISIS, depending on how sane he looked, he may or may not be vulnerable to prosecution. On the other hand, if he has a website set up for people to give money, he's going to get indicted. Yeah.
Hey, Mark.
Just sort of a follow-up to that, what about the reverse? There's stories of American families going over to fight for the Kurds against ISIS. Is that legal? Is
It
that
is.
illegal
It
but
is.
overlooked?
Yeah, so what about Americans that are fighting ISIS, the Kurds, the Peshmerga, other groups? They're not a designated terrorist group. The U.S. State Department maintains a list of about 45 foreign terrorist organizations. If you're not on that list, you can aid that group that's not on that list and not be subject to federal prosecution.
Are there issues about taking oaths to the particular military group or to another nation that then jeopardizes U.S. citizenship or anything like that?
Say that again, please.
If you take an oath to a foreign,
oath, okay.
an oath to a foreign military, is that an issue? I'm not thinking
If you
about
take,
I hope we get some ideas here.
My wife said no.
yeah. I think taking an oath in and of itself does not subject you to federal prosecution. I think there needs to be more than just a word. There needs to be some type of action, whether it's giving money, giving training, giving support in some way. But an oath in and of itself probably doesn't get you over the goal line.
I feel like, at least in my understanding, a lot of these groups tend to be derivative of one another, these terrorist groups. I'm curious if there's any current strategies or concepts or ways that we can be taking action that prevents derivative groups from arising, because it seems like a lot of the action ends up being short-sighted, or there are things that blindside us and turns out, oh wait, now this happened and we need to respond to that, and then something else happens. I'm wondering if there's any long view strategies for preventing that kind of thing from continuing perpetually.
I'll take a crack at this. And this is a great question. And again, going back to my mental test of, if you would have told me a week after September 11th, 2001, that almost 14 years later, our government still would not have an effective counter-radicalization strategy and policies, I would have also been really disappointed, and I am. And this is a bipartisan failure. We in the Bush administration, I worked on this quite a bit. We tried and we failed. We had some good ideas and some projects. Essentially, counter-radicalization, fancy term for how do we prevent young Muslims from not turning into jihadists. How do we prevent them from, signing up for these groups and going from having a more peaceful, moderate version of Islam to wanting to blow themselves up or behead other people, getting radicalized. And there's a number of pathways to radicalization. There is some pretty good research that's been done on this. We're starting to understand how it happens, but we still haven't figured out how to stop it. And the Bush administration tried and largely failed, and the Obama administration has also largely failed. And this is one of the things that worries me, and this is one of the things I think that accounts for why we have this proliferation of these different jihadist franchises, and more recruits joining them. So it's not been a complete failure. There have been some covert programs that can't be talked about that have been effective. There have been some more overt ones. The Saudis, for all their brutality, have actually had a fairly effective de-radicalization program that's at least worked in some cases. But it's called the battle of ideas, essentially, and we're I worry we're losing the battle of ideas.
We have time for one more question.
Just to kind of follow up on that, I'm interested to know how much in kind of the preemptive to keep them from recruiting, like how much economics is playing in that as far as the economic opportunities for kids my age, 20 to 30-year-olds, and because you have the BBC's interviewing mothers saying their sons are wanting to go to ISIS because they have nothing to do in their homes. Is that something we're giving a lot of consideration to try to implement economic?
It is, and in some cases it really is a factor, but I think in some ways it's perhaps been a little overdetermined. I mean, about a month ago, the State Department spokeswoman made a comment about, well, it's largely lack of jobs explains why these usually young 20-something Muslim men go to become terrorists. In some cases, that may be part of it, but the worrisome thing is if you look at the 9/11 hijackers or a lot of the leaders of these groups now, a lot of them are quite well educated, come from middle class or upper middle class backgrounds, and so did not have economic impoverishment, but rather just were, for some other reason, were attracted to this very seductive, radical, nihilistic ideology. So it seems to be some combination of a person who has a set of grievances, feeling like they're not appreciated, maybe they don't have enough opportunity, maybe they've had some other difficult circumstances in life, so they've got that set of grievances, and then along comes this appealing ideology that helps them make sense of all that, and feels empowering and helps give them a grid for mapping out the world and a sense of purpose and meaning. And I'm all for people having purpose and meaning in life, especially those who are aggrieved, but this is not a very constructive type of purpose and meaning. So again, the simplistic, well, it's just poverty and lack of jobs, and if we just do more international development, then no more terrorists, just doesn't work.
Yeah, and just quickly, I think of somebody like Jihadi John, who's British, he grew up in Britain. I think he's a Kuwaiti national, but he's a legal resident of the UK. His parents are upper middle class, was educated, he had opportunity, but he rejected that, and he's a vicious killer who needs to be brought to justice or blown up by a drone strike, in my humble view. But so I want to echo what Will says. You can't just say it's just a matter of education. That's way too simple. Although I did notice when I was with the commissions that I noticed that a lot of the suicide bombers were from the lower rungs, and the ones that sent the suicide bombers on the missions tended to be the more upper middle class, more educated. So,
yeah.
That's what I would say.
Great. All right. Well, that's going to have to sort of do it for us. We're just about out of time. Tonight, again, 7 o'clock, right here. Dr. Inboden will be delivering this spring's Tiffany Lecture on the Middle East four conflicts and the challenges of Christian statesmanship. So if please return, bring your friends, your foes, your acquaintances. We'd love to see you. But please join me in giving our two conversations.